Hello. Hello and welcome to this morning's webinar on philanthropy's role in Australia's net zero transition. I'm Anna Skarbek, CEO at Climateworks Centre, and I'm here with Peter Winneke, who I'll introduce shortly. For those who are unfamiliar with Climateworks, we are a non-profit organisation that develops independent evidence-based solutions to accelerate the transition to net zero emissions for Australia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we are 87% funded by Philanthropy. Today, we're looking at philanthropy's role in Australia's net zero tradition. And before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which each of us are working today or dialing in from. And we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So joining you from here at the Climateworks office, I'm acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and paying our respects to elders past and present, and extending my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I invite you to let us know where you're joining from in the chat. Send us a message. So today, I'm very fortunate to be here with Peter Winneke, joining us for this discussion. Peter is a generosity and life legacy advisor with more than 20 years' experience in strategic impactful giving. As well as having been the inaugural CEO of one of Australia's largest grant-making family foundations, Peter has served Australia's philanthropic sector through the Catherine Freeman Foundation, Philanthropy Australia, the Reichstein Foundation and the Myer Foundation, and he established the Myer Family Office's Philanthropic Services team, where he and the team established 100 family foundations. His new book, Give While You Live, shares his experiences in the philanthropic sector, encourages families to think about a constructive use of their wealth, and provides a roadmap to more and better giving in Australia. So thank you, Peter, for joining us today.
Great to be here, Anna. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this discussion. We will take you through topics covering climate leadership, the future of climate philanthropy, maximising impact through strategic giving, and the role of philanthropy in driving climate solutions. Now, I know that Pete enjoys a dialogue and exchange, so please consider this your opportunity for a small roundtable style dialogue. I know we're using the webinar format, but you can engage with us in a dialogue style through questions in the chat and through Q&A. And we will make sure that after I've had an opportunity to have some questions with Peter, that we hand it to you, the audience, for some Q&A. So I hope you've brought some, and feel free to add some into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We know that the people who are joining us today cover a range of backgrounds and experiences, some individual donors, some foundations, intermediaries, advisors, and leaders operating in government and non-profit sectors. And this event is, for us, an experiment in format and content. So we'd love your feedback at the end. And if a session like this is of merit, we can do it more often. We can do something in person where possible. We're open to how you find it. So do let us know. So let's get going. Thank you. We'll begin with the theme of climate leadership. That's why I know many of you have joined us today. So let's ask you, Pete, what is your view on how important it is to have leaders in the philanthropic space championing their or others' support of the climate movement?
Yeah, and it's really critical that this occurs. One of the reasons we don't have a strong culture of giving amongst high net worth families in Australia is the lack of role models who are giving material sums and then talking about it. So I think it's really important that occurs. We are influenced by what our peers are doing, so we need those role models to step up and give materially, talk about it, and then also I think have a discussion around what are the philanthropic priorities in the country, which I would be staggered if climate change is not one of those. Interesting, Anna, a number of years ago at Philanthropy Australia conference, the opening plenary was given by Larry Kramer, who at the time was the president of the Hewlett Foundation. He said, 600 people in the room, that's terrific. You're all, I gather, doing great work. That's great. If you're not doing climate change and democracy, you're kidding yourself, because they flow on to everything else. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I mean, just imagine if we had major givers to climate change in every state and territory and talking about it and influencing their peers to do more. The impact would be immense. And, you know, frankly, we have the wealth and intelligence to solve every issue on the planet if we can be inspired to do so. So it's really important.
I'm feeling the inspirational energy already, and looking forward to exploring some examples of that. So let's dig in, because I know you're speaking from experience as well as from that sense of imagination of what that power can be. So let's turn to climate philanthropy itself and explore some of your views on trends and predictions and emerging challenges here.
Yeah.
Thinking about what trends you see in the future of philanthropy for the climate sector, it would be insightful to hear your observations on significant shifts in emerging patterns on how philanthropy operates in this field.
Yeah. I mean, a number of the listeners will realise that the environmental space, including climate change, has not received traditionally significant funding from the philanthropic sector in Australia. I haven't seen the PAF stats in the last year, but I know traditionally PAFs were giving well below 10% to the environment. I'm seeing that shifting as people realise the priority that it is. And I think I'm also seeing, spend down foundations are very rare in Australia. The vast majority of foundations are set up in perpetuity. And I think, again, that's the lack of role models around having spend down foundations. That the Chuck Feeney, and one of my heroes, Irish-American, he had this saying, he always talked about giving while living. Let's get on with it. So I think, I'm seeing a little bit of evidence, and I know you have been too, we've talked about this, of there are still very few spend down foundations in Australia, but there are a couple that are around, and more are talking about it. The fourth generation never knows the first generation in terms of, when I say first generation, they're the wealth creators. I have seen evidence that the giving passion can dissipate. So I think families are having the discussion around a family foundation is an extraordinary educational tool for the next generation, for the second generation and third generation. Let's have a think about, do we wind it up after the third generation? And I think another point I'd make here, Anna, is I was working with a foundation a number of years ago, and climate change is one of our focus areas. And we thought, well, let's not reinvent the wheel. What are the donors in the States and Europe? I mean, what are they doing? So that due diligence led us to the European Climate Foundation. And as you know, I mean, they've got some extraordinary climate experts in the room there. We learned a hell of a lot from them just by, it's a pooled funding approach. So we put money into the pool, and it's the climate experts who are making the decisions. So pooled funding traditionally has been a tough space in Australia. And I think that's just the immaturity of the sector, because there's a bit of letting go of the power there. But I see that pooled funding approach increasing as well.
There's so much to unpack here, and if you haven't yet read Pete's book, Give While You Live, it's full of examples, illustrations, stories, case studies. It's a really useful tool. We are fortunate today to extract some of those in real time and share them now. The response you gave just then touched on a couple of themes that we can dig deeper into, and that's around thinking strategically about the approach, and then also about the design and style, spend down, and other examples of that. And they both touch on strategy and format, if you like, sort of tactics, perhaps. So maybe let's explore perhaps some of the recommendations that you have made or do make to clients or those considering this around maximising their impact through strategic giving. I know you explore this quite a lot in your book about this concept, which of course applies to climate change and applies to any sector.
Yeah, it does.
Tell us.
Yeah, I think I find it really interesting, Anna. I see families regularly who are building businesses, and when they build their business and creating wealth, they bring incredible focus and discipline to what they're doing. And then they walk into the philanthropy boardroom, and they put their philanthropic hat on, and that discipline and focus doesn't always stay there, and actually often it doesn't enter the room, which I find curious. So the first thing that I suggest to families that I work with is have some focus. So work out what's the family passionate about. Hopefully that's including climate change, but just pick one or two focus areas, no more than that, and do some due diligence. Build up your expertise, and then once you've determined who's doing the best work in that space, and you're having conversations with them around, well, how do you measure success, and what are the milestones along the way, and how are you reporting to your board on your KPIs, etc. Once you've had those conversations and you're comfortable, well, then just back them long term. I mean, there's not a lot of rocket science in this, but it's as you know, it's rare that, I mean, I talk to CEOs of charities all the time. It's very rare still. Philanthropic sector talks a lot about untied funding. It's rare that you see it. So once you've found the right organisations within a couple of focus areas, back them long term with unrestricted funding, so they can get on with the job of targeting their mission. I think another thing is, we've already touched on the pooled funding. I think that's a great way to learn from the experts. And I think a really interesting example I saw a few years ago, Anna, was in terms of maximising your impact. It's around, what sort of, every foundation's got different resources, and that's not just the balance sheet, it's what sort of skills and networks do you have. A terrific example in the States a number of years ago, this foundation actually had quite a modest balance sheet, but they had a couple of really smart climate people running the foundation, executives. So they took the approach, the board took the approach, or look, let's use that, let's leverage that as best we can, not just with our modest balance sheet. And they actually provided, and still do to this day, a convening role with some really large US, European and Australian foundations, bringing the expertise to the table so that other foundations could just come in and follow the strategy. So I think that's a really good example of know who you are and how you can maximise your impact. We touched on spend downs earlier, but I still see a lot of foundations in Australia that are providing funding to climate change, and they're perpetual foundations. And I sort of find that a bit curious. I mean, if you read the climate science, we need to act now. So then why would you drip feed funding to climate change over the next 50, 100 years? It sort of doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think we need to have a far deeper conversation. Or what are we, board tables? Are we serious about what we're doing here? One other comment I'll make here, Anna, is impact investing. I mean, a decade ago, it was almost rare to see most foundations a decade ago in Australia were just using the one tool, which is the grant. I think foundations have sort of cottoned on. We've got a number of tools. We can use blended capital, we can use debt and equity instruments. So I think that's, we're not just using 5% of the balance sheet. Still not enough foundations doing that. I will make the point though, Anna, that I do see families from time to time who say to me, look, Peter, when you talk about philanthropy and giving, that doesn't quite resonate with us because we're 100% impact. And I'm sort of looking at them and sort of thinking, well, that's terrific. You're growing your pie in a nice, non-harmful way. That's great. We need more of that. But it doesn't seem to me that you're sharing much of your pie. We could have for the next 2 hours, Anna, talking about the number of ways that impact investing is really important, particularly in terms of in investing in new renewable energy resources, for example. But there's a lot of things that impacting investing won't solve, as you well know. So, yeah.
I recognise a lot that you're saying there in applying to climate change basic strategy fundamentals from business, and also as you were saying, you can carry the fundamentals of choose what your focus areas are, play to your strengths, as you mentioned, the connectors. The strengths include resources and wealth, but also include connections and what your special source is, if you like.
Yep.
And also being evidence-based. I certainly recognise that in our sector we have a lot of evidence from the science of climate change and the emissions reduction quantum by sector, an opportunity to reduce in each sector, and of course the race against time. So I'm remembering lots of business school graphs with time across the horizontal and the vertical axis, and we do apply that in climate change. Also, I know in our sector, whilst we might use non-profit language, what you're referring to there about a strategy and an approach to giving, we often would call a theory of change when we're deploying philanthropic funds to create the impact that we and the donors are seeking. We're similarly perhaps not using business school language on strategy, but we are driven by the theory of change on how to win.
Yeah.
So what is our special sauce? What is our strength of knowledge, of relationships, and that sectoral focus, both sector by which I mean which part of the climate sector do we focus, and then also so grassroots, political engagement, policy engagement, research, knowledge, advocacy. There's that spectrum. And then there's also the sector breakdown, which can match business strengths as well, where the emissions are: energy sector, transport sector, nature, agriculture, buildings. So we see increasingly really smooth application of what those outside of climate might consider basic business strategy, and those inside climate would consider it the theory of change of how to win.
And I've seen that. As you know, I've followed the work of climate change for many years, and it's impressive how you go about it.
You also explored pooled funding. We see a lot of that, and I think it particularly has emerged, I want to say recently, in the last few years, there's a lot more of it, although you'd say in Europe it began many years earlier. Yeah. And that's also because this strategic lens is becoming more widely understood. Yeah. The climate science and the ways to win in terms of technologies, policies, and community engagement, they're broadly similar in most countries. Yeah. They do need local application. Yeah. Yep. And so we are seeing many philanthropic foundations pooling by geography or pooling by sector, whether it's electrifying vehicles or homes, or whether it's focusing on Southeast Asia or other local applications. Excellent. So we are seeing quite a lot of that. And similarly, we're seeing new donors focusing on, whether they've read your book or not, a slice of the sector that's relevant to their background. If they've had business strengths in a certain field, they can apply that to their climate change. So perhaps your influence is already evident, but also the evidence is also out there to be gleaned. And the philanthropic sector itself is doing a lot to support those who are interested in contributing. So there's some terrific resources at a number of the philanthropic alliances, whether it's the Australian Environment Grantmakers Network of Philanthropy Australia or Groundswell, who are drawing, speaking to experts, including ourselves and others, and then drawing together this analysis and advice to make it available to others. So we're seeing quite a lot more collective action. And that's outstanding, because, you mentioned AEGN. A number of donors over the years have said to me, climate change, it's too big for us. We're a small or modest-sized foundation. And I say, well, no, that's not the case. You need to go and talk to people. You need to join organisations like AEGN. They've got, I don't know, the latest update, probably 200 members. A fair portion of those members would have small to modest-sized foundations. So it's a matter of meeting those members, having conversations with like-minded donors. AEGN's got a new CEO, Claire O'Rourke, who's got significant expertise in the climate change space, and they're often getting their like-minded donors together. So that's what I'd say to those that are smaller. And also, when I know that Climateworks have some larger donors, but you also have a number of sort of smaller to modest-sized donors, so you can have those conversations with them as well. But there are lots of ways to get engaged. And I've seen the conversation recently go through stages of both explaining, as you've highlighted, climate's different, it needs particular attention, it's got an urgency to it, it wasn't attracting traditional philanthropy some years ago, and that remains true relative to the scale of the challenge.
It does.
But also, when we then focus on how we win, there's an increasing conversation, not just within philanthropic foundations, but also within the policy circles and businesses, that actually the things we need to do to win don't need to be conceivably that different to what we've done in other sectors. So donors that have had success in achieving social policy reform in other fields, political change, government advocacy success, we still need all of those strengths on climate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I've worked with a couple of families they've taken the view that their role could be to fund backbone organisations who are doing, as you're just suggesting, significant work on the advocacy side, funding, backbone organisations who are then a flow-through vehicle to provide funding for organisations who are perhaps getting involved with litigation, which will assist the reduce the amount of emissions, working with the media so they can understand the climate change and the actions that need to be taken. So there's been quite a bit of advocacy work done by backbone organisations, and that's another way that philanthropists can get engaged in that space.
That's right, and also you're referring there to backbone organisations that themselves are avenues to providing philanthropic support.
Yeah,
and we're seeing increasing efforts by backbone organisations on the wealth advisor side, upskilling their own climate knowledge or inviting in climate experts to upskill their own clients and broaden the knowledge base for action. We also find that helping people see, as you said at the start, you've got great skills in business and you can apply these in climate through foundational giving. We also see it that when we are speaking to businesses about and governments about what we need to see change to achieve net zero emissions, we can draw on other changes that businesses have in the past adopted, whether it's improvements in health and safety, in gender equity, in Indigenous engagement. We have successful examples still underway and needing more effort as well, but to see that climate is both different and similar. And so I think your message that you can bring the skills from elsewhere to climate and add climate knowledge is something that we see on both the non-profit side as well as what you're saying you see on the donor side. Are there any more examples we might explore around the role of philanthropy in climate action, where you might illustrate how you've seen philanthropic organisations have a significant influence on impact and outcomes in climate?
I guess a couple of others. I mean, we touched on earlier the AEGN. It has got one family I work with. It had a large balance sheet, so it was trying to work out how it could help those with a more modest-sized balance sheet. So it worked with the AEGN at the AEGN's initiation to develop a climate change funding framework. So this then provided some knowledge and resources for the more modest donors to get engaged and work out what's our role, where can we play here to try and have a positive impact. So I think that's an interesting example of sort of using a bit of leverage. A modest grant then develops a climate change funding framework for an organisation with 200 plus members. So that's how, it's a great way to sort of amplify some impact. I mean, it's sort of a bit weird because I'm sitting with the CEO of Climateworks Centre, but the Climateworks story is amazing. I mean, it's 15 years old. I happen to be company secretary of the Myer Foundation when it started, so I saw it. I mean, you were sharing the office of the Myer Foundation. So before it was originated, as you well know, I mean, the climate change debate in Australia was just full of vested interests. So climate change was, for those that don't know, was a partnership initially with the Myer Foundation and Monash University to try and bring some independence to the debate. And the Myer family has made, and it's done that in an incredible way for 15 years. Developing net zero roadmaps for governments, councils, companies, and a lot more. But a few years ago, I think I should say that Climateworks and the Myer Foundation received a Philanthropy Australia award, and Martin Myer, who was the chair of the Myer Foundation at the time, got up and, the Myer family has made thousands of grants over the years, and he said, this is the best series of grants the family has made. So, I just thought I should say that unprompted, but
Thanks.
That's another great organisation, another great example of Myer Foundation. How do we bring an independent voice here that's create a new body? Really good.
Thanks, Peter. And obviously, proud to have lived that story. And I see you referred, all of that thinking by the Meyer family was more than 15 years ago. And I see it reflected in your book, which was published just 1 year ago, that what you've observed as best practice continues to reflect the features of what I heard you call out there of why Philanthropy Australia might have provided that award, that there was some serious thought into design and what gap philanthropy could fill, the catalyst that was needed. And there was absolutely team effort in being collaborative and drawing in others, working with the university sector, bringing in other donors. Obviously, Climateworks has continued to carry on beyond the initial 5-year period that was envisaged. Now we're at 15 years. So there are many other donors involved, and it reflects what you were saying earlier about sharing that strategic advice and making it open to others.
Yeah. And I know a number of donors have provided the long-term unrestricted funding, which has allowed you and your strong team to just get on with the job. And
I think that picks up on the last theme that I know you touch on in your book, and I know it's absolutely central to the climate change challenge, and that is what we call systems change. Yeah. And I've certainly observed in the international philanthropy movement around climate, but I know in other social reform sectors as well, the sophistication of thinking on systems change has really increased in the last 5 years, and not without good reason. What we have learned is that the climate science is so starkly bearing down on us, and it really is a race against time, that the way to win needs systemic reform, and incremental won't be enough. And that's true of many challenges in the Sustainable Development Goals, across the wellbeing agenda, but some have more of an opportunity for what you might call slow burn type incremental improvement. And what we learned in climate is that the total quantum of carbon emissions is what's causing the damage and the environmental risks. So that's why we have these temperature goals of limiting global warming to hopefully under 1.5 degrees, strive for 1.5 and stay well under 2. So it actually means that every 1/10 of a degree of warming matters, which means every year that we are emitting more than we can sequester, we're costing the planet environmental harm, and that's now reflecting in human harm with extreme weather and damage to food crops. I know you know all the facts, but we live them and hold those truths. So what that has prompted what you call sort of the climate expert community, which includes donors as well as non-profit policy research and activists, is when you mention what you called unrestricted funding, what really sits underneath that is funding at the strategic system change level rather than at the outputs and activities level. Yep. And it's not that they're not connected, but what it's recognising is that we've elevated our focus up to what's the intervention in the system that can stick and that can then harness other system resources to continue. Yep. And the way to achieve that intervention might need some twists and turns along the way. Yeah. And so you're right that the unrestricted funding wasn't unrestricted in the sense that it wasn't tied to outcomes, but it really focused the effort on defining those outcomes at the systems change level. And then that makes it quite hard for impact evaluation and impact reporters, because you've then got to show that we've done our action, which contributes to that outcome, but it's part of a wider systems change theory. So I know it adds to complications sometimes, but it was, I think, part of a really fundamental step change in our own success and others, and also the ability to really focus on what matters and allow us to chart that course with others in the ecosystem. Yeah.
And I know that you were receiving significant funding from a couple of donors, unrestricted, which enabled you and your team to do all that work, because it's as you said, it's very hard. The system change, it's very hard to measure that. So that's why historically donors in Australia have been a bit loath to fund that, because how are we going to touch and feel the outcomes here?
You're right, but I think we broadly in the climate science and emissions community and governments as well as donors have gotten better at defining those outcomes. We know what matters to reduce emissions. Yeah. We're still articulating the interventions that can achieve those outcomes, but broadly they're well understood as well. So then it comes down to the art of alliances and working with the ecosystem and understanding that it takes a village, right? That the policy reforms are done in tandem with the political advocacy and the grassroots engagement and the capability building for decision makers. And that we need all of this to win in climate. And so I think the strategies can recognise that and then focus in on the theory of change. And essentially what the donors are then committing to is their belief in the theory of change and the belief in the players in the system that they support to contribute to that. And then we reflect and review and increasingly share that analysis as well, which has been really helpful. The other thing that sort of funding enables is further funding for smaller initiatives from smaller foundations. And those smaller projects and smaller foundations are still fundamentally important to the work. The majority of our funding is not from the large unrestricted grants, it's from the small and many. But that unrestricted allows us to have that strategy and the systems change view, and then we know what actions are needed in each of the sectors. And that plays well into targeted foundations who have a sector-specific focus, whether it's housing or gas, or transport or energy. And so we find the combination in the climate sector of both large strategy funding and smaller project funding works well together. So we're at the halfway point for those who are tuning in to this webinar dialogue with Peter Winneke, author of Give While You Live, to explore the philanthropic contribution to Australia's transition to net zero and the role of philanthropy in climate change. I know we've got many active players in the sector tuning in today, and so we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for questions from the audience. So do continue to contribute those in the chat and in the Q&A section. And I've got a couple that I want to turn to now, and I do encourage any of you tuning in to continue to feed those in. I've got some colleagues off the screen who are collecting them and sending me through to them on my screen here, Peter. So you haven't seen these ones. But there's a question here for Anna and Peter. For philanthropists who are new to climate giving, what initial steps should they take to determine where their contributions can have the greatest impact? How can they effectively identify and prioritise the most critical areas within the climate movement?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Anna, because it's at that stage where a number of people give up. It's too hard, the issue's too big, we've got a modest balance sheet, or even if it's a larger balance sheet, it's too hard. I would say to those people, don't be deterred, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good work being done. Join organisations such as AEGN, Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. They've got 200 plus members, so people who've been through your journey and they're further down their philanthropic journey, most likely, and talk to the AEGN team. Talk to other foundations. What are they doing so that you don't spend 2 to 3 to 4 years working out what role you can play. So the key advice is to actually don't reinvent the wheel and actually to listen. And some of the themes we've already talked about this morning, Anna, is you're probably not a climate expert. So go and find who the climate experts are and listen, and then work out with your resources, your balance sheet, your skills, the networks, what role can you best play to sort of amplify and maximise your impact?
I remember Christiana Figueres came to Australia just after the Paris Agreement was signed. She's known as a rock star in the United Nations climate change world. Those of you who are newer to the space, she was previously a national member of the government in Costa Rica and a diplomat there. And then when she retired from that role, she became the chair of the United Nations Framework on the Climate Change Convention. That's the UNFCCC, which we call the COP, the Conference of the Parties. This convention has been the most important intergovernmental legal framework for acting on climate change. It introduced the concept of climate change to the world through that United Nations framework. close to 40 years ago. And the annual conference of the parties has continued to ratchet up ambition and knowledge. So there was a big one of those meetings which happened in Paris in 2015, and arising from that came the net zero goal, came the understanding that we must set a maximum limit on temperature warming, and that we could measure that the science had evolved from, even when I first began in this field, we used to measure emissions annually, and you'd do the best you could to do better than last year. And the game changer was the IPCC scientists, the International Panel on Climate Change, which served that UN framework, had spent 6 years analysing the science of climate change, and these fundamental breakthrough became the knowledge that it wasn't just annual emissions that mattered, it was the total stock. That's where we get this concept that net zero means we must prevent adding any additional emissions, and that the quantum we've added between now and that moment of carbon neutrality, net zero, will determine the extent of environmental harm and planetary harm that we've already caused through global warming. So those temperature limits were set in the Paris Agreement, and so was the concept that all nations agree to achieve net zero emissions, to balance these emissions created with emissions sequestered. So she masterfully managed the difficult diplomacy of securing that agreement, hence why she's often lauded and with hero status in the climate movement, but also she continues to be really active in it. So the philanthropy movement hosted her to come to Australia back in 2016, if not 15.
Yeah, I remember.
And she said very similar things, that this might feel like a huge, scary new challenge, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel, in the sense that the organisations that know how to do grassroots, that know how to do activism, that know how to do science into policy, that know how to convene, were there already. And the answer, the call to action for her was to upscale.
Yeah.
And I think if you look back and you think compared to then and now, there's a decade almost, there has been a lot of upscaling. There's still more to do. But indeed, the climate movement is broader than it was then.
Yes.
And you talked about maybe the donors don't consider themselves experts. There are many more climate experts now than before. Even at Climateworks, we're hosted at Monash University. When I began in my field, you couldn't do a degree in some of the related fields for climate action. You might have been able to do the science or the engineering, but not necessarily the translation into what it means for corporate action and for policy. And now my colleagues at Monash are teaching this, and the people we hire are arriving with masters in the field, whether it's renewable energy or the energy performance of buildings. So there is deep expertise now in the field, and long may it continue. And in fact, hopefully not long but short, may it continue to have deeper reach into the fabric of society, really, in terms of, we know we're not there yet on widespread mainstreaming of aligning economic incentives, political appetite, community understanding. I often say one of the biggest challenges we face is inertia, that in addressing climate change, we're asking business and policy and households to do things differently somewhat. So the task is to make that as easy as possible. And that is the unfinished work. We know what to do, but making it as easy as possible is the remaining work.
I should quote the great Casey Chambers, the country and western singer, who she's got this song "Ignorance," which I quote in my book. Not a song to listen to, Anna, after a bad day at the office. It's not an uplifting song, but it's a beautiful song nevertheless. And she says, there's a line in the song, if you're not pissed off with the world, you're just not paying attention. And so that's that inertia. How do we get more people to pay attention?
Well, there are many ways, obviously, as they say, to come at a challenge. And the the scientific basis of climate and environmental action has embedded in me that the ecosystem model, and coming at that question from both the how do we attract attention and awaken interest, with also how do we embed this into what's happening already, so that those who don't want to pay attention don't have to try as hard. There are some basic opportunities to reverse decisions from opt-in to opt-out, for example. Accepting now that this being, for example, the net zero option in procurement from business or government, the net zero option in housing design, as some examples, embedding net zero considerations into transport infrastructure planning. We know that we can intervene in terms of a systems change mindset at the point where the design of the system then orients itself towards that. So that you're not then asking every participant in the system to have to be informed and awakened. You're hoping that the system harnesses that inertia so that it then moves the system towards the goal. So to do that, we do need to awaken enough of the decision makers to make those interventions. But we are now looking through this systems change lens at those points of intervention, which is why we've got a team looking at the building code, for example, and it's why there are opportunities in each of the energy regulatory bodies and other opportunities for investment and decision making, and the way stock market investments are measured and the way companies disclose. So there are lots of opportunities to what we consider mainstream climate into the everyday. And yet we know the awakening and the agitation is the powerful driver for accelerating all of those other mainstream opportunities. So again, it's a twinning. It's taking the ecosystem into play, in my view, which is why it takes a village. So our village is writing to us, and there's another question in the chat board. What advice do you have for funders who are trying to understand how to measure impact in the climate advocacy space?
Yeah, well, I think, again, if you're not a climate expert, that's going to be a difficult, tricky thing for you to do. So again, and we sort of touched on this earlier, Anna, is particularly if you're not a climate expert, work with those that are, and then get them to explain to you, or show us what you're doing, what does success look like for you, and what are the measurables along the way, and get comfortable with those. And if you don't understand it, get them to explain it again, and how that. And we need to move the philanthropic sector away from an acquittal report for every donation. I mean, it's just a terrible use of resources for teams. So when you're working with a potential partner, work out how they measure their impact. I mean, how that the Climateworks board, for example, how do they measure the impact of you and your team? How do you report that to the board? Have the conversation with your potential partners. Well, how do you do that? How do you report to your board on how the team's going? And then share that with us. So there's no extra acquittal reporting having to be churned out for 100 donors, which is a terrible use of resources. So I think the best way is to work with your potential partners. How are they measuring their impact?
The question adds a layer of detail. I wonder if you've reflected on this. You mentioned some metrics there. This question has asked what metrics should they be looking for in relation to climate advocacy? And also the question poses this one, which might be good to explore, how to balance that with trust-based approach and not being too onerous.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of phrases in the philanthropic sector, trust-based. I mean, to me, it's pretty simple. It's the stuff that we've already talked about, Anna. It's have some focus, work out who's doing the best work in that space, and then back them long-term with the unrestricted funding. To me, that's trust-based giving, because you're trusting your partners to get on with the job. And if you don't, well, there seems to be an issue there, and maybe you should go and find some more partners. But it's how are they, as I said before, how are they actually measuring their impact? I think that's the important thing.
Something that we find helps strike that balance is regular meetings. So say reporting cycles might be annual or half annual, and we certainly use quarterly internally. But in systems change, the system is dynamic. So what you say at the start of the year is your goal, is the thing you're straight chasing for, and how we then achieve that win and what are the ups and downs along the way. We find dialogue, or whether it's collective, increasingly we're in groups with other organisations, our peers, who are filling different aspects of that ecosystem, and the donors are bringing us together to hear from all together, and essentially we're all staying abreast of the system dynamics throughout the program period, and then able to adjust in real time when we're aware of what other parts of the system are doing. And then the donors are then aware of those interim decisions. Do we double down on this? Do we change tack a little? Those sorts of judgments along the way. We find engaged donors are paying attention along the way through coming on the journeys, so to speak, which can cover a lot more ground and shared learning than the annual reporting cycle can. That's not to say you don't do annual reporting, right? Like all of us need to articulate what we're focusing on. We put as much effort in at the start to determining, in answer to this question of metrics, how we describe the outcomes we're seeking. So it may not be a metric, it may be an action taken by a decision maker, with a result being the influence of that action from that decision maker, whether it's a government agency or a leading private sector outcome.
And that result might be 2 years down the track, but as a donor, I'd want to see what actions are you going to take over the next 18 months to get to that decision, and how are those actions, so you can see sort of the milestones along the way. Yeah.
With advocacy, I know the question was specifically about climate advocacy. This really goes to how long down the track things are, right? So if we know we need a result in the political arena or subnational, private sector, securing that is where the ecosystem comes in, obviously. So advocacy plays a powerful role at the front end, helping to shift the narrative, awaken those audiences that you referred to, and often at the closing end, when Senate is debating. So depending on the project and who the decision makers are, whether it's targeted around corporate AGMs or political moments. Some government decisions are not taken in a political arena and nonetheless need the advocacy in terms of the evidence base being available and visible and uncontentious, or if contested, clearly understood. So you can plan backwards from those moments and contribute the narrative and the evidence along the way. This is where causation is very difficult to prove in a linear sense.
It is.
And that's where committing to the theory of change is where the upfront work comes in. That the donor is acknowledging at the start that by funding that planned activity, there's a belief that it's valuable in the theory of change.
And where do you work in that broader system, and is it attributable to you, and if so, how, and who else is working in that ecosystem?
And I think to round out for the asker of this question, what I've observed as a recipient and a seeker of funding is that increasingly we're seeing more due diligence at the front end, because in something like advocacy, there's obviously no guarantee, right? None of us can predict how that ecosystem and the system dynamics will change. But there is experience and wisdom in theories of change. And so we're finding that the due diligence is at two layers. It's what is the theory of change? If the donor is investing in an activity where A leads to B and leads to C, firstly, we've got to articulate that clearly. Secondly, what's our experience, so that the donor does the front end due diligence to assess, does this group, it could be a group of partner organisations, a large group, have experience in undertaking the actions where A leads to B, because you can't guarantee that the action will in the future. But if you've had experience in doing it before, who's supporting this group, who's the brains trust around them, so that when things wobble, you've got the ability to keep going. Yeah. So we're finding that a lot more of the donor decision-making, if you like, metrics and focus is at the very start.
Right, that's where it should be, yeah.
Well, we are not at the very start. We are nearly at the very end of our chat with you, Peter. So I am going to move to our concluding session. If there's any last questions, we've got about 1 minute to post them. But some of you may remember at the time of registering that one lucky audience member will also be receiving a free copy of Peter's new book.
Oh, very lucky person.
So this is the email version of the business card in the box. My team have a random selector, and one of you will be a recipient of this book. You can also find the book online if you Google "Give While You Live," the book's title, or if you go to peterwinneke.com.au. Peter is also now consulting families on their giving strategy. And so if you would like support or would like to reach out to Peter, you can do so via his website there, or of course on LinkedIn. And we will put these links in the chat for you in today's webinar. We will, as usual, send a recording of this webinar to you via email. So if you'd like to share it with others, you can do so when it arrives. And of course, you can always reach out to me or Peter directly, or to any of our team at Climateworks. We live and breathe systems change for climate action. And there's nothing we love more than talking about it, and to hopefully support you and others to increase philanthropic support to the sector. I'm really impressed and proud of the peer organisations we have working on climate action here in Australia and also in Southeast Asia. There is no shortage of excellent talent, young and old energy, very, very focused on winning here. And so we know what winning looks like, we know what it takes, and we know we can do it. So we know that any additional resourcing that can come into the sector, particularly philanthropic, is super valuable, and of course super urgent. It's impossible to hide from the truths of the critical climate decade that we're in, and how immense the scale of emissions reduction really is. And I often talk to my colleagues about having to hold both truths. It's a really heavy thing to hold when you know this much about climate science and emissions that keep rising, and that inertia. It's not just a theoretical concept, it is real emissions baked into investments and infrastructure and behaviour. And we see it every day. And yet at the same time, we see the solutions, we see the momentum, and we look back on our 15 years in operation and how different the new normal is, and how far we have come in embedding net zero into expectations. So we know we've got more to do, and in particular, we know the countdown is on for how rapidly we must achieve net zero into our economies. Fortunately, we know that also brings what we call co-benefits. In fact, the real benefits for so many others, in improved wellbeing, cleaner air, lower energy bills, more comfortable homes, more efficient government systems, less wastage and less harm. So they're all wins that are exciting to be fighting for. And I hope that today, those of you who've joined feel empowered to help those around you contribute to this with resourcing and other contributions that you can make. Peter, are there any final reflections you'd like to share?
Well, just a final comment, Anna. I've had the privilege of working in the philanthropic sector for over 2 decades with high net worth families and their next generation. The incredible satisfaction that they receive, families working with their kids and their grandchildren, working with really smart CEOs like yourself and other colleagues that you have, it's an incredibly satisfying experience. And Bill Perkins, the American author, says that that life shouldn't be about the acquisition of wealth; it should be about the acquisition of lifelong memories. And one of the best ways to create lifelong memories with your family is to put together a family foundation, put a significant portion of your wealth in there, and work with really smart leaders having a crack at our wicked problems. Who wouldn't want to do that?
Indeed, and we also feel the same sense of reward when we act on behalf of philanthropy in deploying those resources. As I mentioned, we're nearly 90% funded by philanthropy, and we have to be, because now what we know about systems change, that we know we can make these interventions at really fundamental points in the system that will change the game so that so many other decision makers don't need to put that effort in. The power of our ability to transfer that knowledge into the hands of the decision makers that make those interventions comes from the independence that philanthropy gives us.
Yeah.
To be unaligned commercially, to be unaligned politically, is only possible because of the philanthropic support. And that is amazingly powerful. And it's why we've been able to have the success we have. And for me, I see that this is now the opportunity for philanthropy, because we know exactly where those interventions are and the ecosystem is ready to deploy, and philanthropy can really turbocharge it.
Let's do it.
Indeed. I hope you feel the same. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you feel able to leave not just with ideas, but commitments to act and ability to do so. And we know that your engagement and leadership across the sector, from the fields that you represent and the entities that you can bring to bear on this, can accelerate climate solutions, as well as inspire others to follow suit. In the opening remarks about inspiring others, making what you do more visible so that others can see that they can do it too. So thank you for tuning in and showing your interest in this. I do hope you feel excited that this, whilst the gap might be huge, it's a gap that philanthropy is really well placed to fill, and that we have enormous collective potential to bridge it. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to you continuing to support climate action. Goodbye for now. Thank you.